All right, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. This is Galen Barbos with Lawrence Berkeley Lab. I'm joined here by my colleague Naeem Dargouth, and we're excited to share with all of you some highlights from the latest edition of our annual Tracking the Sun report. Before getting started, I'll just run through kind of standard housekeeping items. So first, this webinar is being recorded. And we will post a recording on the website in the next couple days. You'll be able to find that at the URL at the bottom of the title slide here, trackingthesun.lbl.gov. That's also where you can go to find the report itself, as well as a variety of other kind of supporting documents that I'll, that I'll describe on the next couple slides. Excuse me. Also wanted to mention that we'll have some time at the end for questions and answers. And so hopefully you all can see a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So please, as we go through, enter in any questions that you'd like to have answered. Naeem will be kind of organizing those and getting them queued up for the Q&A session at the end. So definitely encourage you to enter your questions in as we go. So with that, let's begin. So many of you are probably familiar with Tracking the Sun. This report is now, I think, on its 15th year, perhaps. But for those that aren't, the basic gist of this report is to summarize installed prices and other characteristics of grid-connected distributed solar PV and PV plus storage systems in the United States. For the purpose of this report, distributed solar includes residential systems, as well as roof-mounted non-residential systems and ground-mounted systems up to 5 megawatts AC. Any ground-mounted systems larger than 5 megawatts, those are covered in our companion report, Utility Scale Solar, which, as it happens, was just released this morning. This edition of Tracking the Sun, it focuses on systems installed through the end of last year, through 2022. And it, as I mentioned, talks about project characteristics. It describes pricing trends. And we spend a fair amount of time and attention kind of looking at pricing variability across individual systems and trying to understand some of the factors that contribute to that. In addition to the report itself, which is essentially a longer version of this PowerPoint deck, there are a number of other items that we published. One is a short executive summary style narrative brief. We also have a data visualization tool, which allows users to poke around in the data and develop custom figures. We have a public data file, which is a very, very large file containing all of the underlying project level data that is summarized in this report, at least that which we can share. And then lastly, we have an Excel file that contains all the figures and the underlying summary tables from the report. So if there's a particular figure and you want to know the actual numbers that are being plotted in the figure, you can go to that Excel file and find that information. So all of that stuff, again, is available on our project page, trackingthesun.lbl.gov. So first, let me talk a little bit about just the underlying data that we assemble for this report. So all of the trends that we'll show are based on project level data, so individual distributed PV systems. We collect that data from state agencies, utilities, a variety of other organizations. We also, in recent years, have been getting data from a company called Ohm Analytics, who compile data from local building permitting systems. And so some of that data also finds its way into our analysis here. Altogether, the report is based on data collected from 70 different entities across 30 different states. Though, at least for the last year here, we're relying mostly on data from 44 organizations covering 26 states. A few important definitions to just be aware of as we go through the report. So, as I mentioned, we cover both residential and non-residential systems, where those residential systems If ground mounted, go up to 5 megawatts or 5,000 kilowatts in size. Within the non-residential segment, we also further segment the systems in some cases into small versus large non-residential systems, where we use 100 kilowatts as the cutoff. All of the pricing data, unless otherwise noted, is denominated in real 2022 dollars. All of the system size data is in DC watts, unless otherwise noted. And the installed price system prior to any incentives. And as I'll mention at least one more time, they include any upfront loan financing fees, dealer fees that may be passed through the installer to the customer. Oops, misbehaving here. So our sample consists of 3.2 million systems installed through the end of 2022. That represents a little over 80% of all distributed PV systems installed in the US. Just within the last year, our data set includes 500,000 systems that were installed in 2022. The full sample is what we use when we kind of talk about trends in system characteristics. When we look at trends in installed prices, we focus on a subset of that larger full sample, and that subset consists of about 1.5 million systems, so roughly half of the full sample. Here we show just some details on our sample distribution across states compared to the market as a whole. And the first thing you'll notice is that California, shown in dark blue, dominates the sample, as it does the larger PV market. And so as we go through some of the trends in the report, there will be various points where I might note how the trends are really being driven by California, where we report national numbers. And if California differs in significant ways from other states, we do try to call that out. In general, if you compare our full sample to the overall US market, you can see that we've got pretty good coverage for most of the larger state markets. Really kind of the only main exception there is Florida. The bigger gap, I would say, in our data set is the collection of kind of smaller state markets, which we aggregate here in the others category, that kind of light blue gray segment at the top. So that's if there's a gap in our data, that's really where it is most significant. Okay, sorry, my PowerPoint is really not behaving very well here. Okay, so now with that, we're going to look at some of the trends in PV system characteristics. First, we'll look at trends related to system size. And so if you look at the figure on the top, which focuses on residential systems, you can see how residential system sizes have been rising steadily over the past 2+ decades. And that's really being driven by, well, a number of factors, but first and foremost by declining costs. So systems are getting cheaper, and so customers can afford to install larger systems. Module efficiencies are also improving over time, and so customers are able to fit a larger number of watts on a given roof area. And so together, those two factors explain a lot of this increase in system sizes that we've seen on the residential side. For non-residential systems, which is the figure on the bottom, you can see that sizes vary quite a bit across non-residential systems. And for that reason, we show both the median size trend and also the trend in average system sizes, where you can see the average is much higher than the median, just reflecting the long upper tail to that distribution. Looking at trends over time, they're a little bit irregular, but what you can see is that early in the middle of the time period shown here, there was this rather abrupt increase in average system sizes and a greater prevalence of large non-residential systems. Those trends have largely tapered off since about 2014, so over the past 10 years or so. And in fact, last year we saw a little bit of a dip in the prevalence of those large non-residential systems. I think it is just important to stress here that although we often think about non-residential PV as being large rooftop systems, maybe 100, 200 kilowatts in size, most non-residential systems, in fact, are quite small. The median size was just 25 kilowatts last year. So most of the non-residential systems out there are in that size range. Here we just show how sizes vary across states, focused just on the last year. And you can see, looking at the residential figure on the top, I think the main point to just stress is that California is pretty far over on the left-hand side. In other words, system sizes in California are generally smaller than what we see around the rest of the country. And so those national trends that we were looking at on the last slide, those are very much driven by California's dominance within the US residential market. And in most states other than California, typical residential system sizes are larger. Most states more than 8 kilowatts, and in many states above 9 kilowatts. The non-residential figure on the bottom, the main thing to stress and notice there is really what's happening at the upper end of the distribution, where there are a number of states where large non-residential systems are just much more prevalent than in other states. And at least in a number of those states, for example, Minnesota and Maine, that largely has to do with community solar. So these are large, but still sub 5 megawatt ground-mounted systems that are serving community solar subscribers. Here we see trends in third-party ownership. Looking at the figure on the top, you can see that within the residential market, the TPO share has continued to slide. It was at one point in time up around 60% of the market. Last year, it was 25%. And this in large measure reflects the growing prevalence of solar loans as the dominant form of financing. Within the non-residential market, TPO trends are a bit more stable. They do wiggle a little bit from year to year, but in general, we haven't seen any major movements over the last 5 to 8 years. So within the report, there are some other trends in PV system characteristics that we won't cover within the webinar here, but I would just mention them. So the first are trends in module efficiency, which I mentioned a couple slides ago. We look at trends in the use of module level power electronics, so microinverters and DC power optimizers. We look at trends in inverter loading ratios. So that's the ratio of the module DC wattage to the inverter AC wattage, and how those have changed over time. We look at trends in ground mounting and the use of tracking equipment. That's obviously more prevalent for large non-residential systems than for smaller systems, but it still exists within those segments as well. We look at trends in panel orientation. So, for example, our panels, do we see an increasing prevalence of west-facing panels as regions see growing amounts of solar production and peaks shifting into later parts of the day? And then lastly, we, in the report, look at trends in non-residential customer segmentation. So kind of how does the non-residential market break out between government customers, schools, nonprofits, and for-profit commercial facilities? And before moving on, I'll just remind all of you, which I think Naeem has in the chat as well, to please feel free to ask any questions you might have in the Q&A chat box as we go. All right, so over the past few years, we've devoted increasing amount of attention within Tracking the Sun to looking at paired PV plus storage systems as these have become more prevalent in the market. And so the next few slides, we just present some of the trends related to that portion of the market. So here we look at trends in attachment rates. So what percentage of new PV systems installed each year includes storage? And you can see in looking at the figure at the top that within both the residential and non-residential market, attachment rates have been rising over time. About 10% of all residential systems installed last year included storage, about 7% of non-residential systems. And then the figures on the bottom show how those attachment rates last year vary across states. Looking at the residential figure, you can see that Hawaii has by far and away the highest residential attachment rates of any state, virtually 100%, 96% last year of all new residential PV systems had storage. California, which is where the majority of paired residential PV plus systems exist, had attachment rates of about 11% in the residential market, and a little less, about 8% in the non-residential market. Looking at other states on the residential side, you can see there are a good number of others that also have attachment rates in the kind of 10% range, similar to California. And most states are at least at or above 5%. And so, one of the key trends and themes to note here is that, we are seeing really across the board greater interest in paired PV plus storage in the residential sector. It still is, a small part of the market outside of Hawaii, but we're seeing interest and growth in many, many states. On the non-residential side, it's a little bit more mixed. You can see, again, Hawaii has the highest attachment rates. California, Massachusetts, and Oregon are also in the kind of 8 to 12% range. But most other states are much lower. And I think that largely just speaks to the fact that within the non-residential market, customers are more sensitive to the economics and by extension, what sort of underlying forms of policy support might exist for adoption of PV plus storage. So attachment rates really speak to new installations, so new PV systems. But there are also a lot of storage systems that are being retrofitted onto pre-existing PV systems as well. And so what the figures on the top here show, if you look at just kind of the totality of all new PV plus storage systems that were installed or completed last year, about a quarter of those, 23%, were actually storage retrofits onto pre-existing PV systems. So that's a significant and important part of the market as well, that often I think gets missed within the focus on attachment rates. The slide here provides a number of details about the characteristics and the sizes of paired PV plus storage systems. I'll just kind of quickly walk through a number of these. So if you look at the figure on the upper left, where we show the distribution of storage sizes for paired systems installed last year, you can see spikes at these kind of 5 kilowatt intervals. And that largely just reflects that some of the kind of dominant storage manufacturers, they sell batteries in 5 kilowatt increments. And so essentially what you're seeing here are customers that had either 1, 2, or perhaps 3 of those 5 kilowatt units installed. The figure on the upper right shows the trend over time in those numbers. And there you can see that in general, the market has been trending towards systems with larger batteries. So and that trend actually did kind of reverse course slightly last year, but you can see that in prior years there was this declining share consisting of systems with just 5 kilowatt size batteries and larger share with 10 or 15 kilowatt and above batteries. And that trend, I think, largely is driven by backup power demand. If customers want to provide backup power during long duration outages, they often will need more than just a 5 kilowatt battery. And so as that use case has gathered steam, we've seen the market migrate towards progressively larger batteries with their PV systems. The figures on the bottom, I think I'll just mention very, very briefly. On the lower left, we show PV system sizes for paired systems. And really, the main message there is that the larger the battery, the larger the PV system. And the figure on the lower right, we show durations of residential batteries installed. And you can see this based on the dominant manufacturers. Most of those are kind of in the 2 to 3 hour range. Here we show similar set of figures for non-residential paired systems. I won't go through all of these. I'll start with just the figure on the upper right where we show trend in storage sizes. And here we see really the opposite of what we saw on the residential side, where within the non-residential market, systems have been trending actually towards progressively smaller storage systems, smaller applications. In the early years, a lot of the paired non-residential systems were really targeted to very large non-residential users who were on rates with significant demand charges. And so these systems were being installed mostly for the purpose of demand charge management. As the market has evolved and as the technology has progressed, we've seen really a movement towards smaller customers who are using these batteries for a wider range of use cases, not just demand charge management, but TOU arbitrage, backup power, solar self-consumption, maybe participation in virtual power plant programs or demand response programs. All of those sorts of things. And so as those other use cases have emerged, we've seen this natural migration towards smaller applications that perhaps better reflect just the kind of the population of non-residential solar adopters overall. So I'm going to turn now to the data on pricing trends, and we're going to focus first on trends in just median installed prices. After this, I'll talk in more detail about kind of variability in prices, but here let's just look at trends in the median prices. Couple things to note here. As I mentioned, this installed price analysis, we rely on kind of a subset of our larger data sample. And in drawing that subset, we exclude a number of different categories of systems, one of which are third-party owned systems. So we exclude those partly because the price data that are reported for those systems are just kind of difficult to interpret and to compare with the prices for host-owned systems. We also exclude self-installed systems. Another important note here is that these installed price data are self-reported by the installers or by the customers, and so naturally there's some noise in the data. And I think our belief is that with enough data we can kind of see the signal through the noise, but there certainly is some noise. As I mentioned previously, the reported prices for loan finance systems may and probably do in most cases include some sort of dealer fee. And those fees, we unfortunately don't have visibility into the size of those fees, but we know that in general they can vary anywhere from, say, 5% up to as much as 20 or 25% of what a customer would pay had they purchased the system outright. And so the fact that those dealer fees are included, that obviously adds a pretty significant extra component to the reported prices for these systems. And then lastly, the prices are adjusted for inflation. We actually did include a figure here that looks at changes in nominal prices, just given the importance of inflation over the last couple of years. But otherwise, everything that we show is inflation adjusted in real 2022 dollar terms. So here we see long-term trends in median installed price, and we're focusing here just on standalone PV systems. So there'll be another figure later on where we look at paired PV plus storage systems, but we're going to focus initially just on standalone systems. The figures at the top show long-term trends in the installed price of these systems. And you can see, particularly if you look at the residential figure on the upper left, that there was a period kind of in the middle of the time frame shown here when prices fell very rapidly. And this was a period when module prices globally were falling quite dramatically. And you can actually see that in the figures at the bottom where we provide component level pricing data. Since about 2013 or so, we've seen a very steady trend of prices dropping by about 10 to 20 cents per watt per year, really across all three different market segments. And that trend persisted this last year. And so this is sort of the steady state that we've been observing over the past decade or so, this price decline of about 10 to 20 cents per year. If you look at the figures on the bottom where we kind of break out some of the underlying components in those overall system level prices, you can see what's happened to module prices, inverter prices, and then the solid lines at the top show the residual, which is basically all of the other balance of systems and soft costs. And those residual soft costs now comprise the vast majority of overall system prices. And those costs have themselves been falling at about 10 to 20 cents per year over recent years. And so really, I think the main story here is that going forward, the trajectory of system level prices is really dependent on what happens to soft costs. There's not that much more that can be squeezed out of module and inverter prices, but future cost reductions in distributed PV are almost entirely dependent on what happens to soft costs over time. And at least over the past decade, they've been falling at a relatively steady pace of about 10 to 20 cents per watt annually. So as I mentioned, we typically just focus on trends in real inflation adjusted prices, but given the significant inflation that we've seen over the past few years, we wanted to also provide some data here looking at price trends in nominal terms. And so the figure on the top, it shows quarterly median installed prices. The kind of heavier bolded line and bolded text are the trends in real prices, which we were looking at on the previous slide. And then the dashed lines with the italicized numbers are the trends in nominal prices. And so what you can see here is that while, as we mentioned, real prices have been falling, nominal prices have risen over the past couple of years, depending on the market segment by about 10 to 30 cents per watt over the 2-year span shown here. Now, the fact that nominal prices rose while real prices fell, that is just another way of saying that nominal prices rose at less than the rate of inflation. And so while folks within the industry are certainly grappling with the impacts of inflation, it may be cold comfort, but it's nevertheless important to also understand that any inflation within the PV sector or the distributed PV sector has been less severe than the inflation that the broader economy has observed over this time. So we're not the only ones who put out PV pricing benchmarks. There are a number of other entities who also publish data that often get cited. Some of the large publicly traded installation firms, SunPower and Sunrun, their quarterly financial reports include data on average system costs. Energy Sage, who many of you may be familiar with, they publish regular market data reports that include data on the price of systems quoted over their platform. And then our friends at NREL and at Wood Mackenzie, they both publish regular market data reports that include modeled pricing benchmarks. And so the figure here just compares the median national prices from Tracking the Sun to these other benchmarks. And although there are maybe one or two exceptions, in most cases, what you can see is that these other benchmarks are reporting prices that are lower than the medians in Tracking the Sun, and are in most cases more aligned with the 20th percentile values that we observe within the market data that we collect. And there are a number of different reasons for this. A lot of it is kind of apples to oranges kinds of comparison issues, whether you're looking at prices versus costs, quotes versus actuals, assumptions about markups, etc. The one thing that I'll mention now, perhaps for the third time, is this issue of loan financing fees, which do add potentially up to 25% in some cases to the cost of the systems that are, or the installed prices rather, that are being reported in the market data that we see. So that certainly is one important factor that helps to explain some of these differences. But it's important to be aware of these differences. Okay, so lastly here, as I mentioned, all of the preceding pricing figures all are focused on standalone systems. Here we look at price trends for paired PV plus storage systems. And then the figure at the top, you can see how those trends have evolved across the three different market segments. You can see on the residential side, there has been this steady decline in median prices for paired PV plus storage systems. It's not necessarily the case that underlying battery component costs have fallen by this amount or this steadily over that period. But certainly the market has matured quite a bit in terms of just a much greater diversity of products, a much larger and more diverse set of installers who are installing paired systems and who have experience with these systems. And so to some extent, the trend that we see on the residential side, it just reflects that kind of market maturation. The trends for the non-residential segments are a little bit more uneven. Part of that just reflects the small sample sizes and kind of idiosyncrasies in the underlying data. At least within the small non-residential segment, though, it also probably reflects the trend that we saw earlier towards progressively smaller systems. So as we saw in the early years, most of the non-residential paired systems were relatively large, but we've seen this pretty dramatic shift in recent years towards smaller systems. And so that may be manifesting here in terms of an increase in the median price of systems within the data set. So those trends all are based on median prices. But one of the nice features of the data set that we assemble for Tracking the Sun is that it allows us to observe just this tremendous variability in prices. And so we spend some time in the report, and we've spent quite a bit of effort over the years in kind of separate side analyses, trying to kind of dig into the different factors that explain some of this pricing variability. And so I'll just provide some insights there based on what we provide in Tracking the Sun. So the figures here show the distribution in installed prices for systems just completed last year in 2022. And if you look at the figure for residential systems, you can see just this really wide distribution. So, I mean, just the 20th to 80th percentile band, that ranged across a span of $2 per watt, from $3.20 to $5.20. But then outside of that percentile range, you can still see these, pretty fat, wide tails, indicating just this tremendous amount of variability in system pricing. And that variability, it reflects a whole variety of different factors. It reflects differences in project characteristics, the size of the system, the kind of equipment that's being used, how old the home is, and what kind of electrical work or structural work might need to be done to accommodate the PV system, those sorts of issues. It can reflect differences in the installer, how much experience the installer has, how aggressive they are in their pricing, that sort of thing. And then it can reflect the many different features of the local market policy and regulatory environment. So, first and foremost, there are just some places where everything's more expensive, and so PV systems tend to be more expensive there as well. But then within, the kind of the PV market more specifically, there may be important differences in the permitting and interconnection processes that impact system prices. There may be important differences in kind of the level and stability of policy support that impact kind of how the market grows and how installers kind of market and price their systems. And so there are many, many of those kinds of factors that we can kind of dip our toes into within this report, but that to a significant degree are issues that are kind of topics of their own and deserving of analyses of their own. So I'll just kind of walk through some of the underlying drivers and give you a sense for how they impact some of this overall pricing variability. So first, we look at differences in prices based on system size. Not surprisingly, larger systems cost less than smaller systems. We see that when comparing residential to non-residential, and we see that even within the non-residential segment when looking at differences across system sizes there. And so, for example, just within the residential segment, there's basically $1 per watt difference between systems at the smallest end and largest end of the size spectrum shown. On the non-residential side, even wider differences in pricing reflective of the much larger differences in system sizes. There are also differences in pricing across states. And so you can see those here, where on the residential side, differences of as much as $2 per watt or more between the least expensive and the most expensive state. Some of those differences are idiosyncratic, but some of those differences also reflect kind of more fundamental features of the market within these different states. And the regression analysis that we'll present at the end attempts to kind of tease out the impacts of some of those underlying fundamental drivers. Here we show differences in pricing across installers. So just to explain kind of how we've constructed the figure here, we're focusing just on the top 100 residential installers last year. Each dot is the median install price for an individual installer, and we've just ordered those from the lowest to the highest. And then the shaded band shows the percentile range across systems installed by each of those installers. And so you can see that there's quite a bit of variability in pricing across individual installers. Some of that reflects kind of firm level characteristics. How much experience do they have? How long has the firm been around? How big are they? What are the kind of equipment and component preferences? What kinds of relationships do they have with vendors? And really, how aggressive are they pricing their systems? Some of it, of course, also just has to do with the features of the markets in which these firms operate. Many installers are local firms that may happen to operate in relatively expensive or relatively inexpensive markets. And so some of this installer level variability that we observe here is in fact really more just a kind of an artifact of the variability in pricing across the markets where they operate. So there's some other pricing trends that we present in the report, which I will skip over here, but just mention in passing. We look at install price differences based on module efficiency level, based on the use of module level power electronics, and based on the specific non-residential customer segment. So how do prices compare between kind of tax-exempt non-residential customers broadly versus for-profit commercial customers? And so lastly here, I'll just very quickly share with you some of the results from the regression analysis, where we try to kind of more precisely estimate the impact of various pricing drivers by comparing some of the underlying kind of interrelation, by accounting for some of the underlying interdependencies among those pricing drivers. And so this is a ordinarily squared regression model. The table here lists the different variables, the different pricing drivers that are included in that model. Don't worry about looking at the coefficients in the table here. The next slide, I'll present another figure that kind of helps to compare the relative impact across these drivers more directly. I would just note at the bottom of the table, we provide the R-squared value for this model, 0.12. What that means is that, while the model does allow us to estimate with a fairly high level of confidence how a number of factors impact installed prices, in the end, we're still only able to explain 12% of the overall pricing variability. So there's a lot of kind of residual pricing variability that reflects either just noise in the underlying data, kind of measurement error, so to speak, as well as unobserved variables that we simply don't have data on. That being said, we can estimate how some of these factors do impact installed prices. And what we show in the figure here is kind of relatively how each of these factors impact prices compared to one another. If you look at the system level pricing drivers at the top of the chart, you can see that battery storage has by far the biggest impact. We estimate about $1.50 per watt premium for residential systems with battery storage compared to standalone systems. After that, the next largest pricing drivers were system size, which impacted prices by about 60 cents per watt between the 20th and 80th percentile levels, as well as new construction systems. So residential PV installed in new construction was about 60 cents per watt less on average than systems installed in retrofit applications. And that's after controlling for all of the other kind of factors. You can see the market and installer related drivers. Those all had relatively small effects, and in most cases were not statistically significant. And then at the bottom, you can see this wide gray bar, which shows the kind of the range in the state fixed effects variables. And so the way of interpreting that is that's kind of the remaining pricing variability that reflects differences at the state level above and beyond all of the other factors listed above. So after controlling for all of those other factors, that's the residual pricing variability that still exists from state to state. And this last chart here just shows those kind of residual state fixed pricing effects compared to the median pricing differences. And what you can see is that, in most cases, these fixed price effects are, well, they can be either larger or smaller, actually, than the differences in median prices. In most cases, it's, within a band of about 30 cents per watt, either higher or lower than in California. So that's, in effect, kind of the unexplained state level pricing differences that we see. So with that, I'm going to end here. I know we've got maybe about 15 minutes left for Q&A. I see a decent number of questions in the Q&A chat box. And so I'm going to hand the mic over to Naeem, who will help us run through some of those questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Galen. And we do have a number of questions, as you indicated. So let's get to some of them. Okay, so let's begin on, do we have data on share of racking systems? So I'm guessing those are perhaps ground mounted, how those are broken down and whether they're in the report.
Yes, we do. The report, and actually I have it here. I just threw all the extra slides in at the end. So here we go. So this here we can see how trends in ground mounting have evolved over time in each of the market segments. And you can see, so for example, within the large non-residential segment, 34% of systems were ground mounted, 12% of small non-residential systems were ground mounted, and 1% within the residential segment were ground mounted. If the question though has to do with like market share of different types of racking equipment, that we do not have other than just data on the use of tracking.
All right. Do we have data to be able to calculate the ratios between the hard and soft costs and how that has changed over time?
I mean, what we have is basically the data that I showed earlier. And I apologize, there's just a really big lag in the slide, so it's hard for me to quickly navigate through the deck. So the data that we have is just the total installed price. And then from that, we can infer the soft costs. And we do that by just backing out kind of average module and inverter prices. And so that's what is shown in the figure here. That's how we derive the values here. But we don't, within the data that we collect, we don't have any more granularity beyond this.
Okay, just a quick follow-up to the ground-mounted question. Are canopy and ground-mounted lumped together?
They are insofar as the entities who are inputting the data are kind of categorizing canopy systems as ground mounted. We don't have any generally any ability to sort of differentiate within our data set between canopy and other types of ground mounted systems. And so I assume that the ground mounted systems in our data set, some portion of those are canopy, but we unfortunately aren't able to identify those specifically.
So one question is whether we have any analysis of tracked versus fixed PV. Just the person is noting that increased production offsetting tracker pricing for small systems is a common question that they get. So we may be able to answer part of that.
Yes, so we in this year's edition of the report, I don't think we actually did this. In prior editions, though, we have looked at pricing differences for systems with and without tracking. Basically fixed ground mounted versus tracking ground mounted systems, obviously focusing on large non-residential systems. That data, unfortunately, it tends to be really noisy and idiosyncratic because the sample sizes are so small. I do believe, though, that our colleagues who publish the utility scale solar market report, that they do include pricing analysis that distinguishes between fixed and tracking systems. And that data it's just a richer data set given the much larger number of tracking systems on the utility scale side.
Question whether we have any off-grid solar installation data?
No, we don't. We exclude off-grid from this analysis.
Okay, so this person notes that the price trends are similar in terms of percentage reductions in South Asia. However, the national averages on residential systems are less than $1 a kilowatt. And for larger systems, it's even lower than that, to 70 cents a kilowatt hours. And so there's no question here. I think the implied question perhaps is any insights as to why this may be. So kind of a 4 times, prices here being 4 times as high.
Yeah. So first I would just note that the prices that we derived from our data set, which are, reported values. It's real data, but it's subject obviously to a lot of noise. That those numbers are higher than what others often report for the US. And so depending on where some of the numbers from other countries are coming from and how they're derived, there may be a little bit of an apples to oranges issue in comparing those numbers to the values that we're reporting here. And so I think, I think to do this comparison fairly, one would need to collect the same kind of data from other countries and really look at how that compares to the US. That being said, I don't think any amount of apples to oranges kind of resolution can explain the large differences that we observe between the US and many other markets. Prices in the US, at least for distributed PV, are just a lot higher than in other countries. And this has been something we've been aware of for a long time and have spent time looking at. A lot of it comes down to soft costs, and a lot of that has to do with the costs of customer acquisition, the costs of permitting and interconnection processes in the US. There's been a lot written about how in many other solar markets, those processes have been streamlined to a degree far beyond what has been accomplished in the US. So I don't think there's any single explanation, but it does really ultimately come down mostly to soft costs, and the two biggest pieces there tend to be customer acquisition, and then a lot of the kind of overhead costs that in some form or another may be the result of permitting and interconnection and inspection related processes.
Okay, so a couple questions about changes that have been implemented in 2023. So NEM 3.0 in California. Also, just generally kind of higher loan interest rates in 2023, which could lead to higher number of third-party owned residential systems. Do we have any insights on kind of sneak peeks for trends in 2023?
We don't, unfortunately. Yeah, I think this next year's edition of the report will definitely have some interesting trends in it, but we have not started collecting that data yet. So unfortunately, it would be premature to speculate.
Yeah, great. So a question on oh, right. So why storage attachment rates are so high in especially Hawaii, but just more generally, what drives the differences in storage attachment rates by state?
So in Hawaii, Hawaii began its transition away from net metering quite a few years ago. I'm not sure exactly when it began, but it's been underway for many years. And they, no longer offer full net metering. Hawaii has adopted a net billing structure where exported PV receives a much lower rate than retail. There are also a number of options that basically prohibit customers from exporting anything, and so in Hawaii, this trend is really largely driven by kind of rate structure, particularly net metering reforms. Oops, this is the wrong figure. Sorry, here we go. In California, I think there are some other factors. Certainly, net metering reforms are part of it. California also, as folks within the state are no doubt aware, and maybe others, for a number of years, the utilities have been calling rotating outages public safety power shutoff events. And so, many customers have experienced, extended outages. And so some of the growth that we've seen in California is no doubt driven by resilience concerns, customers interested in backup power. California also offers incentives through the self-generation incentive program for customers to install behind the meter storage, as do a number of other states. And so some of the differences that we observe in attachment rates are a function of resilience concerns, incentives, and other kind of programmatic offerings, demand response programs. There are a number of states that have launched kind of various types of bring your own battery type programs. And so a lot of what we see, I think, is probably tied to those sorts of offerings.
Great. So we probably have time for maybe one or two more questions. Yes. So why are third-party owned systems excluded from the pricing trend figures?
Yeah, so that's sort of a methodological choice, and it's something that we've done for many years, and it's really because the price data that is reported for those systems, it's sort of a little bit ambiguous in terms of what it actually represents. In some cases, it may represent the price that is paid to the installer by the third-party financing company, in which case it's an actual transaction, but it's perhaps a different price than the installer would have charged the customer had the customer purchased the system outright. In other cases, it might just be some appraised value, so not an actual transaction price, but just sort of an estimate of what a typical system would cost. And so it's hard to know what those numbers mean. I think that's the bottom line. And so for that reason, we've excluded them. For that being said, the prices that are reported for TPO systems aren't, in fact, actually all that different from host-owned systems. At least in recent years, maybe 5-10 years ago, they were very divergent. But if you look at the data for recent years, they're actually pretty similar. And so had we included the TPO prices, the numbers that we would report would not be substantially different, but just out of an abundance of caution, we decided to exclude them.
Okay, so maybe one final question, and apologies, we weren't able to get to all the questions. You can always follow up with us by email, and we'll be able to answer whatever additional questions you have. Perhaps you can pull up our email address. It's right there. Great. So the last question is that this person noticed that there's a public data file online and kind of wanted to know what is included in that data file and any more information.
Well, I guess I could ask you to answer that question.
Yes, I can.
You're the master of that
Indeed.
file.
And so we do have a data file online that includes a large majority of the individual system level data points we have in the data set. So over 2 million data points, which include a number, almost all of the fields that we have, not including the street address, because for those we receive that data under a non-disclosure agreement. And then there are a few programs that don't allow us to share publicly the data. That said, as I said, it's most systems are in there. It's in CSV format. It's too large to be opened in Excel, so it needs to be opened in a data, another kind of platform, software platform, whether it's in R or MATLAB or whatever you would use. If you want it in kind of several pieces, email me. I can send it to you so you can open it in Excel as well. We update that every year, and this is the most recent version. You can find it at trackingthesun.lbl.gov.
And Naeem, you have sort of like a README or user guide, right, for it?
Yeah, right. So there's a user guide that includes a description of all the fields that are included, incomplete for most systems, but all the fields that are included in that data. file as well as some instructions on how to download the file.
All right, great. Well, we are at time, just over time, actually. So we'll wrap things up here. Thanks everybody for joining. Hopefully this was worth your hour. As Naeem mentioned, please feel free to email either of us if you have questions about the report or the data, or anything that we discussed during the webinar. And other than that, we'll just look forward to seeing you on the next LBL webinar. Take care.